So I want you to picture um, a goal you've been chasing recently.
Like something massive.
Right, yeah, something massive, like a promotion you've been grinding toward for, I don't know, 3 years. Or finally getting your startup off the ground.
Or it could be something deeply personal, too.
Exactly, like finding the right partner or getting pregnant or even just, getting your physical health back to a baseline you remember from a decade ago.
Right.
Think about how that pursuit felt on day one. You probably woke up energized, right? There's this sense of possibility, of beautiful, pure desire that just pulled you forward.
You're moving towards something good.
Yes. But now think about how that exact same pursuit feels 6 months, a year, maybe 3 years down the line when it hasn't happened yet.
It feels heavy.
It feels incredibly heavy. If you're like most people, this very subtle, almost imperceptible shift has taken place. That goal is no longer a destination you are joyfully walking toward. It has become a tyrant.
Wow, a tyrant. That's a good word for it.
It is, because it becomes this strict, uncompromising requirement for your happiness. You wake up not with energy, but with, suffocating pressure. The joy is completely gone.
The joy just evaporates.
And every time there's a minor setback, a rejected application, a bad date, a negative test result, you don't just feel disappointed. You feel a profound existential panic. Like reality itself is breaching a contract it made with you.
You feel cheated by the universe.
You feel totally cheated.
Well, it's a universal human experience, you
Yeah.
know, and it's fundamentally about how we structure our relationship with the future. Because when a pursuit turns dark like that, the friction isn't usually coming from the outside world.
Where's it coming from then?
The friction is coming from a structural flaw in how we're processing our own ambition.
And that structural flaw is exactly what we are going to tear apart today on this deep dive.
I'm so ready for this.
Me too. We are looking at this brilliant, really dense academic paper by Professor Hisataka Takasugi. It's titled Desire Without Entitlement, The Existential Logic of Want Thinking in Early Christianity.
It's a fantastic paper.
It really is. Our mission today is to dig into this material and extract what is essentially a hidden psychological masterclass. We're going to look at a radical third way of dealing with human desire.
A way to hold on to what you want without letting it crush you.
Exactly. And the sources we have today are fascinating because Takasugi is pulling from the earliest texts of the Christian tradition, right? Like the Synoptic Gospels, the letters of Paul.
But he's doing something really unique with them.
Yeah, he is passing them straight through the filter of modern cognitive psychology and contemporary neuroscience.
And that synthesis is what makes this material so compelling. I mean, Takasugi isn't treating these ancient texts as, lists of moral rules.
Which is how they are so often culturally digested today.
Right, exactly. Instead, he is treating them as diagrams of human psychology. He argues that the people who wrote and lived these texts were mapping out a highly sophisticated, structurally coherent orientation to reality.
They were trying to solve the exact problem we just described.
Yes. How does a human being hold on to their deepest, most desperate desires while remaining fully engaged with a universe that flat out refuses to immediately hand them what they want?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we look at the ancient world, we really need to set the psychological baseline.
We need definitions.
Right. We have to understand the actual mechanics of why our goals turn on us. And Takasugi builds his foundation on the work of Albert Ellis.
The founder of rational emotive behavior therapy?
Yes, REBT. For anyone unfamiliar, Ellis was a titan of modern psychology back in the 1950s. And he made this fascinating observation about human suffering, specifically regarding the difference between a preference and a demand.
So to understand Ellis, you have to look at the cognitive sequence of an emotion.
Walk us through that.
Well, we tend to think that an external event directly causes our emotional reaction. You fail a test, so you feel depressed.
Cause and effect?
Right, simple cause and effect. But Ellis pointed out that there is a hidden middle step. The event happens, yes, but then you filter that event through a specific belief system.
Okay.
And it's that belief system that actually produces the emotional consequence. So Ellis noticed in his clinical practice that human desire, like the raw preference for a good outcome, never actually causes disproportionate suffering.
Wait, really? Desire itself isn't the problem?
Not at all. If I say, I would strongly prefer to get this job and I don't get it, I filter that rejection through the belief of a preference.
Because it was just something you preferred.
Exactly. The resulting emotion is sadness, frustration, maybe a healthy dose of disappointment.
Which is a completely normal, healthy human reaction to a negative event. I mean, you aren't supposed to be thrilled when you lose.
Precisely. You shouldn't be happy about a rejection. But the problem arises when that preference covertly mutates into a rigid, absolutistic demand.
It hardens.
It does. The belief shifts from, I would prefer to get this job, to, I must get this job, and if I don't, it is a total catastrophe, I am utterly worthless, and my life is over.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the stakes are suddenly life or death.
Exactly. When you filter a rejection through that specific belief system, the resulting emotion isn't just sadness. It is clinical depression, panic, and this paralyzing sense of distress.
So Ellis realized that the root of neurotic suffering isn't the desire itself.
No, the root of the suffering is the cognitive hardening of the desire into a non-negotiable law.
Okay, so Takasugi takes this specific clinical insight from Ellis and expands it. He builds it out into 3 distinct existential categories that describe how we interact with our own desires.
And these are so important.
They really are, because they are the lenses we will be using for the rest of this conversation. So category number 1 is what he calls must thinking.
This is exactly what Ellis was warning about.
Right. It's when your desire calcifies into a demand. You feel a literal entitlement to the outcome. You are operating under the assumption that the universe owes you this result.
The mechanism of must thinking is characterized by conditional safety.
Conditional safety, what does that mean for the body?
It means your nervous system is essentially telling you, I am only safe, I am only acceptable if X happens.
So your brain is literally treating it like a survival threat.
Exactly. Because the stakes are perceived as absolute, your body ramps up its threat response. You become highly reactive.
That makes so much sense.
When the universe inevitably throws a roadblock in your way, you don't just see it as a logistical problem to solve. Your brain interprets it as a literal threat to your survival.
It's like treating reality as a breach of contract. I think of like an entrepreneur who puts 100 hours a week into their business.
Oh, totally. The hustle culture mindset.
Right. They do all the quote-unquote right things. They
Right.
read the books, they hustle. And when the market shifts and the business fails, they don't just grieve the loss of the business.
They're furious.
They are absolutely furious at the universe.
Uh-huh.
They demand to speak to the manager of reality because they put in the coins and the vending machine didn't drop the soda.
That transactional mindset is the absolute hallmark of must thinking.
So that's category 1.
Yes. Now, contrast that with the second category Takasugi outlines, which is wishful thinking.
Okay, what is that?
This is the polar opposite reaction to the unpredictability of reality. Instead of demanding that the universe comply, the wishful thinker retreats entirely into passive fantasy.
Right, this is the person sitting on the couch daydreaming about writing a best-selling novel, but they haven't typed a single word in 6 months.
We all know someone like that, or we've been that person.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
They are completely detached from action, risk, and responsibility. They hold the desire, but they refuse to engage with the actual friction of the real world.
Because wishful thinking is ultimately a defense mechanism.
How so?
By never actually attempting the goal, the wishful thinker protects themselves from the pain of failure.
Oh, that makes sense. If you never try, you never fail.
Right. They maintain the illusion of potential without ever putting that potential to the test. It's a way of avoiding the terror of must thinking by simply refusing to enter the arena.
Which brings us to the core concept, the third category, and the absolute focus of Takasugi's paper, want thinking.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It really does. The definition here is very specific. Want thinking is desire held without entitlement to the outcome.
It sounds like a paradox at first, doesn't it?
It totally does.
Yeah.
I mean, you want something with every fiber of your being. You act purposefully, vigorously, and intelligently toward that goal. You do not shy away from the work or the risk.
Right.
Yet, simultaneously, you fundamentally accept that reality is not yours to command. You formally relinquish any metaphysical entitlement to the result.
You hold the desire, but drop the demand.
Exactly. The analogy that helps me wrap my head around this is planting a garden.
Oh, I love this analogy.
And it works so well. If you are a farmer, you don't just sit on your porch and engage in wishful thinking, hoping tomatoes magically appear in your kitchen.
That would be a terrible farming strategy.
Right. But you also can't engage in must thinking. You can't walk out into the field and scream at the clouds, demanding that it rain.
Because the sky doesn't care about your demand.
Exactly. If you try to sue the sky for a drought, you're just going to make yourself crazy. So want thinking is the sweet spot. You till the soil. You pull the weeds. You do the agonizing, backbreaking work of planting the seeds.
You do your part.
You do your part. But you operate with the fundamental understanding that the ultimate outcome, the weather, the yield, the locusts, It's entirely out of your control. You do everything in your power, but you drop the demand that the harvest owes you anything.
The farmer analogy is perfect because it highlights the preservation of agency. You are still acting.
Yes, very active.
But, I anticipate a serious objection here from anyone who operates in a high-pressure environment.
High achievers.
Right. We are culturally conditioned to believe that if you don't demand an outcome, you won't work hard for it.
Oh, definitely. The whole failure is not an option mentality.
Exactly. The common wisdom is that you need that burning intensity to push through obstacles. So how does Takasugi address the idea that dropping the demand might just lead to complacency?
I read that section of the paper 3 times because it is so counterintuitive to how we are raised.
We idolize the must-thinkers.
We do. We idolize the CEO or the athlete who says, I will accept nothing less than total victory. But Takasugi's framework, leaning on cognitive psychology, shows that decoupling ambition from entitlement actually increases your functional capacity.
That is fascinating. How does it increase it?
Well, think about the cognitive load of must-thinking. If my entire identity, my worth as a human being, is tethered to an outcome I don't control, my nervous system is in a constant state of low-grade panic.
Oh, absolutely. And the physiological toll of that panic is measurable.
Tell me about the physiology there.
When your brain perceives a threat to your identity, which is what a must-thinker experiences when a goal is jeopardized, it triggers the sympathetic nervous system.
Fight or flight.
Exactly. Cortisol floods your system. Your amygdala takes the wheel. And the really crazy part is that your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for creative problem-solving, nuance, and long-term strategy, it actually powers down.
Wait, it literally shuts off.
It significantly decreases in activity. Your focus narrows to tunnel vision. You become brittle. If you hit a wall, your cognitive flexibility is gone. You just keep slamming your head against the wall because you literally cannot process an alternative route.
Wow. So the high achiever, who is running on must-thinking, might get a lot done in the short term, but they are burning dirty fuel.
They're dirty fuel.
They are using existential terror as their motivator. Whereas want-thinking, by completely removing the threat of catastrophic identity failure, actually frees up your cognitive bandwidth.
Because you aren't in a panic state.
Right. You can pursue the goal with more creativity and more resilience because you aren't wasting mental RAM on demanding that the universe obey you.
Yeah.
If the strategy fails, you don't have an identity crisis. You just changed the strategy.
You've removed the existential friction from the pursuit. You're working just as hard as the must-thinker, perhaps harder, but your nervous system is operating from a state of safety rather than a state of threat.
That is a massive paradigm shift. But if this is the psychological theory, how does it look in practice?
Right. Where's the historical proof?
Exactly. This is where Takasugi does something incredible. He takes these modern clinical definitions and overlays them onto the oldest recoverable strata of the Christian tradition.
He wants to see if this psychological architecture was present in the ancient world.
Yes. And the ultimate existential prototype he points to, the absolute pure demonstration of want thinking, is the narrative of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before his execution.
It is a brilliant choice of text, honestly.
Why do you say that?
Because Gethsemane is universally recognized as a moment of acute psychological extremity, and Takasugi isn't analyzing the theological implications of the atonement here.
Right, he's looking at the psychology.
Exactly. He is analyzing the psychological structure of a human being in crisis. He argues that before any early Christian theology was written down, the narrative structure of this event performed the argument.
Let's look closely at the earliest account in the Gospel of Mark. The text says Jesus is deeply distressed, to the point of death, and he prays this specific phrase, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will.
That prayer is a 3-part psychological blueprint.
Let's break it down because it maps flawlessly onto the want-thinking framework. Step 1, remove this cup from me.
Think about what is happening there.
The desire is being expressed with brutal, visceral honesty. He knows he is going to be tortured and killed, and he says, I do not want this.
There is no fake Zen master routine here.
No.
There is no spiritual bypassing where he pretends that suffering is actually fine.
And the rejection of spiritual bypassing is a critical element of want thinking. You do not lie to yourself about what you want.
River.
If you were terrified, you acknowledge the terror. If you desperately want the promotion, you admit it.
Because by expressing the desire honestly, you prevent it from being repressed into the subconscious, where it would inevitably mutate into resentment or passive aggression.
Right. But then you hit step 2. And this is the fulcrum of the entire philosophy, the word yet.
Yet not what I will, but what you will.
In that single clause, the entitlement is structurally withheld. He holds the intense desire to live, but he actively refuses to convert that desire into a demand.
He acknowledges that the ultimate outcome rests in another's hands.
And he accepts that reality.
Notice the nuance here, though. This isn't fatalism.
Right, he's not giving up.
A fatalist says, well, I'm going to die anyway, so what's the point of praying or feeling anything? And this also isn't a grudging, bitter surrender.
It's highly intentional.
It is an intentional structural feature of the mind. The desire is held at maximum intensity, but the demand that reality must bend to that desire is actively surrendered.
Which naturally leads to step 3. What does he do after the prayer?
He doesn't curl up in a ball in the garden.
No. He doesn't flee into the woods. The text says he rises, wakes his sleeping friends, faces his betrayer, and walks directly into the chaotic action of the arrest.
Desire expressed, entitlement withheld, action continued.
That is want thinking in its purest form. He maintains his agency in the face of an outcome he did not want.
By analyzing Gethsemane in this way, Takasugi establishes that want thinking is not about escaping the friction of human life. It's about how you process the friction.
But Gethsemane is an extreme crisis scenario. Does this orientation apply to everyday life?
To answer that, Takasugi points to the Beatitudes.
The famous list of blessings in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek.
Exactly. And this is where cultural baggage really gets in the way.
Oh, for sure. If you grew up around religion, you probably heard the Beatitudes taught as a list of highly coercive moral laws.
It often comes across as an imperative. You must become pure in heart, or God will be angry with you.
You must be meek, or you're failing. We read them through a lens of must thinking.
We project our own demand structures onto the text, but Takasugi points out that the actual Greek grammar of the text is completely different.
What's the original Greek say?
The word used is makarios, which translates to blessed, flourishing, or deeply well. These are not prescriptive laws. They are descriptive announcements.
Descriptive, not prescriptive. That's a big difference.
Huge. Jesus isn't standing on the mountain issuing behavioral demands under threat of punishment. He is making observations about the nature of reality. He is describing the shape of human flourishing.
He's basically outlining the physics of the human soul. He isn't saying you are required to mourn. He is saying when you mourn, when you are in that space of loss without demanding a quick fix, you are actually in a space where deep comfort can reach you.
It's observational.
Right. Take the line, blessed are the meek. In our modern hustle culture, meekness sounds like weakness. It sounds like being a doormat.
Totally.
But in this framework, meekness is the exact opposite of the entitlement orientation. A meek person is someone who doesn't insist on getting their due. They don't walk into a room demanding status.
And because they aren't exhausted by constantly defending their ego, they end up inheriting the earth. They actually get to enjoy the world because they aren't trying to conquer it. Look at, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. This explicitly validates intense desire.
You can have a deep, agonizing hunger for justice to be done in the world.
But you hold that hunger without the corrosive entitlement claim that reality must deliver that justice on your exact timeline. Must thinking requires an imperative formulation. You must, you shall.
The Beatitudes invite.
They affirm the legitimacy of the desire, but detach it from the competitive entitlement structures that inevitably generate human resentment.
Resentment is the key word there.
Yeah.
And it brings us to one of the most vivid illustrations in the paper, the parables. Specifically, the parable of the prodigal son.
Everyone knows the first half of that story.
Right. The younger brother takes his inheritance, wastes it on wild living, hits rock bottom, and comes home. The father runs out to meet him and throws a massive party. It's a beautiful story of grace.
But Takasugi focuses intensely on the second half of the story.
Which is all about the older brother.
And the older brother is a masterful psychological study in the pathology of must thinking.
How so?
Well, he has stayed home his entire life. He has worked the fields. He has done everything right. But when he hears the music from the party for his screw-up younger brother, he refuses to go inside.
He's furious.
The father comes out to plead with him, and the older brother explodes. He says, listen, for all these years, I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends.
It is the ultimate corporate meltdown.
Yes.
If the guy who has been at the company for 10 years watching the new hire get the corner office, The older brother is the textbook symptom of the demand structure. He's taken his years of faithful service and secretly converted them into an entitlement claim.
His internal monologue is, I worked, therefore I am owed.
He viewed his relationship with his father not as a relationship, but as an employment contract.
His desire for recognition, for a goat to celebrate with his friends, is perfectly valid. The tragedy is the structural mechanism he uses to process that desire.
By converting it into a rigid demand, he actually exiles himself from the party.
And the father's response is incredibly revealing here. He doesn't invalidate the older brother's desire. He says, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours.
The father is trying to dismantle the entitlement structure.
He's pointing out that the older brother has always had access to the joy, the resources, the relationship. It was the older brother's own transactional accounting system, his rigid demand for a specific, measurable form of compensation that made him miserable.
He was starving himself while holding the keys to the pantry, all because the food wasn't served on the specific plate he demanded.
Exactly.
So Jesus is laying this out in parables. He's modeling it in Gethsemane.
Yeah.
But parables and narratives are open to interpretation, right?
Very much so.
If you want this psychological framework to survive, you have to systematize it. You have to explain how it works to people living hundreds of miles away, decades later. If Jesus provides the narrative action, how did the early communities build the theological architecture?
That is the specific role of the Apostle Paul.
Paul. Okay, tell me about Paul.
Paul is writing letters to communities scattered across the Mediterranean, trying to help them stabilize this new orientation to reality. And to do that, he develops a highly technical vocabulary.
What kind of vocabulary?
The two most critical terms he uses, which Takasugi asks us to look at through a psychological lens, are law and grace.
Let's spend some time here because these words have so much historical baggage. When Paul talks about the law, he isn't just talking about the Torah or specific religious rules, is he?
No. Takasugi argues that Paul is diagnosing a universal human psychological condition. Paul's critique of the law is that it operates as an achievement-based demand system.
An achievement-based demand system.
Exactly. When a human being operates under law, they're treating life as a standard that absolutely must be met to prove their worth.
So it doesn't matter if that standard is religious perfection or a specific body fat percentage or a specific net worth.
The psychological mechanism is identical. A standard is set. You demand of yourself that you must meet it. And because the standard is absolute, any failure to meet it generates profound anxiety.
Paul writes about the crushing weight of this anxiety in Romans 7, right?
Yes, it's one of the most agonizing descriptions of psychological friction in ancient literature.
He describes the experience of the divided self. He says, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate.
He is describing a person who is entirely trapped inside a demand structure.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. That is the phenomenological experience of must-thinking turned inward. The demand is total. The consequence of falling short feels catastrophic. The will is captured within a demand it simply cannot fulfill.
And the result isn't moral improvement, is it?
Not at all. The result is paralysis, exhaustion, and intense self-condemnation. The demand structure acts as a magnifying glass, illuminating the massive gap between what is required and what you can actually achieve. That gap is experienced in the body as pure guilt.
If the law is the ultimate diagnosis of the demand structure, Paul offers an antidote. He counters the law with grace and faith. But just like the law, we have to strip away the Sunday school definitions of these words.
You really do.
Grace, in this framework, isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. Grace is the structural collapse of the entitlement system itself.
Think about the logic of a gift. If an outcome is purely a gift, you cannot demand it.
You can't.
You cannot stand as a claimant before reality, waving your resume, demanding to be paid, if the fundamental nature of the universe operates on unmerited favor. Grace destroys the transactional arithmetic of the older brother. It removes the ledger entirely.
And faith, the Greek word pistis, is how a human being receives that grace. Faith is not intellectual assent. It isn't just checking a box saying you agree with a list of historical claims.
No, faith is existential trust. It is the active posture of want thinking.
Takasugi highlights Paul's use of Abraham as the ultimate case study in faith.
Abraham is promised by God that he will have an heir. But decades pass and nothing happens.
Decades.
Paul notes in Romans 4 that Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, or when he considered the barrenness of his wife Sarah.
He looked at the brutal, unvarnished reality of his situation. He didn't use wishful thinking. He didn't say, oh, I'm sure I'll feel 30 years younger tomorrow.
Right, he was realistic.
He acknowledged the biological impossibility of his desire. But he held the desire anyway, and he trusted the promise without demanding that God explain the timeline or the mechanism. He relinquished sovereignty over the outcome while maintaining total engagement with the promise.
The psychological outcome of replacing the demand structure with this posture of existential trust is what Paul calls freedom.
And we see the zenith of this in his letter to the Philippians.
Yes. Paul is writing from a literal prison cell. He is facing possible execution. Yet, he writes, I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty.
Notice the word learned. I've learned to be content. This wasn't a magical state of enlightenment that just dropped on his head. It was a trained cognitive elasticity.
He is in prison. He clearly desires to be free. He desires to visit his friends. He is actively writing letters to shape the future of his communities. He has immense burning ambition.
But he has entirely dropped the entitlement to a comfortable outcome. He can be content in a dungeon or in a palace because his internal state is no longer tethered to reality meeting his demands.
That sounds incredibly inspiring on paper, but practically speaking, there is a massive gap between understanding Paul's theology intellectually and actually functioning that way when you are sitting in a prison cell.
Or a hospital waiting room, or a bankruptcy hearing. This is exactly where the academic caper pivots from ancient theology into modern cognitive science. Because I can read Paul, I can agree with Ellis, I can understand that must thinking is destroying my life.
You can know it all.
I can have a massive intellectual breakthrough on a Tuesday afternoon and vow to never demand anything from the universe ever again. But on Wednesday morning, when my boss sends a highly critical email, my heart rate spikes to 130 beats per minute, my stomach ties itself in knots, and I'm instantly back in a state of existential panic.
We all are.
Why? Why doesn't the cognitive realization immediately fix the physiological reaction?
To explain this mind-body gap, Takasugi introduces a framework called the Unified Theory of Metaphysical Psychology, or the UT model.
The UT model. Unpack that for us.
This model proposes a multi-layered architecture of the human mind, operating simultaneously on different frequencies. Let's look at the extremes. At the very bottom, you have layers 0 and 1.
What are those?
These are your autonomic nervous system and your precognitive somatic patterns. This is your biological hardware. It controls your heart rate, your hormone release, your implicit memory, your fight or flight reflexes.
It's the stuff we don't control.
Right. These layers operate incredibly fast, and they operate entirely below the level of conscious thought.
Okay, so that's the hardware.
Yes. Now jump to the top. Layers 4 and 5 represent your explicit cognitive and evaluative layers. This is your conscious thought, your language, your philosophical beliefs, your theology. This is the part of your brain that reads a book, understands a concept, and makes a logical decision.
So my realization on Tuesday afternoon that I need to be a want thinker happens at layers 4 and 5. I have successfully updated my cognitive software. I downloaded the Grace and Faith operating system.
Exactly.
But the problem is that my hardware layers 0 and 1 is still running on decades of habituated trauma and must thinking.
It's like your laptop fan is just screaming.
Right. My prefrontal cortex says, I am safe, this is just an email. But my amygdala and my nervous system are screaming, we are under attack, prepare for battle.
That is the precise friction. Grace operates at the cognitive layer, but must thinking is deeply entrenched in our somatic nervous system layers.
So it's stuck in the body.
Yes. And Takasugi categorizes this entrenched demand structure into 3 specific types of must mode. First, there is episodic must mode.
What does that look like?
This is a momentary flare-up. You are generally healthy, but under acute sudden stress, you snap into a demand. This is Jesus in the first seconds of Gethsemane saying, remove this cup. It's an episode.
You catch it and you process it.
Correct. But the second type is much more dangerous. Structural must mode. This is when the demand orientation has become a habituated cognitive somatic schema.
It's just how you function.
It is your default baseline. You don't consciously choose to be terrified of failure. Your nervous system is permanently wired to interpret reality as a threat if it doesn't bend to your will. This is the divided self Paul was agonizing over. The body's automated responses are at war with the mind's conscious intentions.
And Takasugi mentions a third type, institutional must mode, which we will explore heavily later, where an entire organization or culture is wired for demand. But let's stick with the individual for a moment. If my nervous system is stuck in structural must mode, reading another theology book or listening to another self-help podcast isn't going to fix my cortisol levels.
Not at all.
I can't think my way out of a physiological trap. How did the early Christian communities, operating thousands of years before we had fMRI machines, solve this mind-body gap?
They solved it through the technology of daily communal habit. They realized that you cannot rewire the autonomic nervous system with a lecture. You can only rewire it through embodied, repeated practice.
And this brings us to what I consider the most striking insight in Takasugi's paper. He frames early Christian liturgy, specifically the Lord's Prayer, not as a rote recitation of doctrines, but as a sophisticated instrument of existential formation designed to literally recalibrate the nervous system.
It is brilliant.
The idea that a 2,000-year-old prayer is functionally a neurobiological training regimen is wild to me. Unpack the science of this for us. Takasugi connects the Lord's Prayer to contemporary contemplative neuroscience, specifically mentioning something called the Direct Access Protocol, or DAP. What is the mechanism there?
The direct access protocol is a concept in modern psychological research that studies how specific, rapid, repetitive cognitive interventions can shift the body's autonomic state.
Okay, so a hack for the nervous system.
Essentially, when you are in structural must mode, your sympathetic nervous system is highly active. You are in fight or flight. To shift back to a receptive want-thinking baseline, you have to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode.
How do you do that?
You do this through vagal nerve stimulation. Deep, regulated breathing, combined with focused, repetitive phrasing, is one of the fastest ways to signal safety to the brainstem. The DAP is essentially a rapid induction sequence designed to interrupt the anxiety loop and downregulate the threat response.
Wow. So when an early Christian sat down and intentionally recited the Lord's Prayer, the very act of pacing their breath and vocalizing the words was acting as a physiological brake pedal.
Yes. But it's not just the biological act of speaking, it's the specific cognitive content of the words, right? Let's deconstruct the petitions of the prayer through this lens.
Okay, let's look at the content.
The content is perfectly engineered to dismantle the demand structure. Take the petition, give us today our daily bread.
Notice the time constraint there.
Exactly. It is a desire for sufficiency, explicitly limited to the present moment. Must thinking constantly projects into the future. It demands a 10-year supply of bread to eliminate all future uncertainty.
Right, because you want to feel safe forever.
By praying for daily bread, you are forcing your brain to accept the reality of ongoing dependence. You are asking for what you need right now, intentionally leaving tomorrow out of your control.
It's an anti-hoarding mechanism for the soul. And then you hit the structural center of the prayer. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. This is the exact echo of Gethsemane.
Is the explicit, vocalized relinquishment of the entitlement structure. The prayer surrounds this central pivot point. You ask for bread, you ask for forgiveness, you ask for deliverance from evil. The desires are vast and profound.
But they're all governed by this central acknowledgement that the final outcome belongs to God. You ask, but you train your brain not to demand.
Furthermore, consider the pronouns used throughout the prayer. It is never me or mine. It is give us, forgive us, lead us.
Why does it matter?
Must thinking is inherently competitive and isolating. If my core operating system dictates that I must win to have value, it usually requires that someone else must lose. It is a zero-sum game.
Oh, that makes sense. By forcing the practitioner to use plural pronouns, the prayer systematically destroys the competitive logic of entitlement. You are practicing want thinking as a communal organism. You are desiring sufficiency as a shared human condition rather than a personal victory over your neighbor.
And the frequency of this practice is the key to the whole thing. Takasugi references the Didache, which was essentially a training manual for early Christians written in the 1st century.
What did it say?
The Didache explicitly instructed followers to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night.
That frequency aligns perfectly with what we know about neuroplasticity.
Hebbian learning dictates that neurons that fire together wire together.
Right. If you want to shift to somatic baseline, what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called habitus, a set of durable, ingrained dispositions, you cannot just engage the practice when you feel like it. You have to create a rhythmic interruption of your day.
By stepping out of the flow of daily commerce and survival 3 times a day to enact this rapid induction protocol, they were actively installing the cognitive software of grace into the neurological hardware of the body.
They were physically training their brains to endure desire without panic.
Exactly.
So we have the theory, the prototype, the theology, and the physical training regimen. At this point in our deep dive, someone listening might be thinking, okay, I understand, The goal is just to let go. Stop caring so much, whatever happens, happens, become bulletproof.
I hear that a lot.
But we have to hit the brakes here, because it is incredibly easy to mistake want thinking for other, more culturally familiar philosophies. Takasugi outlines 4 specific misreadings of this concept. We have to clearly define what want thinking is not, or the entire framework collapses.
Founder definitions are vital here. The first misreading is confusing want thinking with fatalism.
How are they different?
Fatalism is the belief that the outcome is entirely predetermined and human action is meaningless. The fatalist abandons both the demand and the desire. They assume the script is already written, so they stop caring and they stop acting. They become apathetic.
Which is the exact opposite of what we've seen. Jesus didn't sit in the garden waiting to be arrested. He got up and walked toward the confrontation. Paul didn't sit silently in prison. He wrote letters that shaped Western civilization. Want thinking maintains vigorous, forceful agency. You relinquish the demand for the outcome, but you never relinquish the responsibility to take action.
The second misreading is confusing it with wishful thinking, which we touched on earlier, but in modern terms, we might call this toxic positivity.
Oh, toxic positivity is everywhere.
Wishful thinking is the refusal to engage with negative realities. It's closing your eyes, ignoring the red flags, and just hoping the universe rewards your good vibes.
It's the entrepreneur who is running out of cash, but refuses to look at the spreadsheet because they want to stay positive. Want thinking requires brutal, unflinching realism. It goes back to Abraham looking at his aged body. Want thinking doesn't evade adverse circumstances. It looks the disaster right in the face, but refuses to make the entitlement claim that reality must suddenly change its nature just to accommodate you.
The third crucial distinction involves the realm of social justice and ethics. People often worry that if we adopt want thinking, it will lead to moral passivity.
If I stop demanding that the world be fair, won't I just stop fighting against corruption, poverty, or systemic evil?
Right?
I hear this argument all the time. People think anger and demands are the only valid fuel for activism. But Takasugi suggests that releasing the demand actually sustains moral action over long haul.
Think about the activist who operates on pure must thinking. They demand that their efforts must instantly solve a systemic issue.
And when progress is agonizingly slow, when politicians lie, when movements fracture, that activist is highly vulnerable to burnout, deep resentment, and eventual despair. They either become toxic to their own movement or they quit entirely.
Because their internal stability was tied to an immediate, measurable outcome, want thinking allows an individual to fight for what is right with relentless energy, but without the paralyzing anxiety that their specific efforts have to guarantee a total victory on their preferred timeline.
They fight because it is the right thing to do, not because they are entitled to witness the ultimate triumph. It creates a much more resilient form of moral courage.
But the fourth distinction is the one that really trips people up, and I want to spend some time chewing on this. Want thinking is not Stoicism.
And this is tough, because right now, Stoicism is having a massive cultural renaissance.
Huge. Every tech CEO and podcaster is reading Marcus Aurelius.
And the Stoic promise is incredibly seductive. Progressive detachment. The Stoics train themselves to only care about what is entirely within their control, their own internal thoughts and reactions. They methodically kill their desire for external things. Wealth, health, even the safety of their loved ones. If I kill my desire for external things, the world can't hurt me. It's the ultimate hack for peace of mind. Why wouldn't I want to be bulletproof?
It is a profound philosophical hack, and we have to respect its utility. In the classical world, there were primarily 2 dominant options for dealing with the agony of human desire. You had the Aristotelian option, which argued that flourishing required fulfilling your desires by acquiring the right external goods, virtue, yes, but also health, friends, and a bit of luck.
The problem is, reality often denies you those goods, leaving you miserable.
Then you had the Stoic option. Extinguish your desire for the external goods to protect the inner citadel of your mind. Apatheia.
So Aristotle says, get the stuff to be happy, and the Stoics say, stop wanting the stuff to be happy.
Exactly. But early Christianity forged a revolutionary third structural possibility. The third way. Stoicism detaches from desire. Want thinking preserves desire entirely, but detaches from entitlement.
That is the razor's edge. But honestly, preserving the desire sounds like you are just leaving yourself exposed to pain. Why not just take the Stoic route and build the fortress?
Because the fortress becomes a tomb. Killing desire protects you from disappointment, yes, but it also deadens your fundamental humanity. If you systematically train yourself not to care whether your loved ones live or die, you insulate yourself from grief, but you also amputate your capacity for deep, vulnerable love. You become untouchable, but you also become unreachable.
You stop participating in the human experience.
Want thinking is the far more courageous path. It allows you to remain fully alive, fully passionate, fully invested in the fragile beauty of the world. You allow yourself to want deep connection, meaning, and success. But you remove the structural demand that weaponizes those desires against you.
You stand in the world with open hands, saying, I genuinely want this and I do not require that it be delivered for me to be whole. It is permeability without fragility.
That is perfectly said.
It's the difference between building a concrete bunker to hide from the storm and learning how to stand in the rain without breaking. That is such a beautiful, vital distinction. But this naturally leads us to a massive, slightly uncomfortable historical question.
I know where you're going with this.
If this third way is so psychologically brilliant, if it's this perfectly balanced orientation that preserves humanity while defeating anxiety, what happened? Because if you look at the history of Western religion or even modern secular culture, it doesn't look like a society of want thinkers. It looks like a society entirely dominated by guilt, anxiety, massive institutional demands, and intense must thinking. How do we lose the technology?
Takasugi addresses this by identifying the historical conditions under which the demand structure returned, and we must be extremely careful and clear here.
Yes, to our listeners, we are impartially reporting the paper's historical and psychological analysis.
We are looking at this strictly through the lens of organizational psychology and structural shifts. We are not taking sides on whether these historical shifts were inherently good or bad in a political or denominational sense. We are simply tracing the mechanics of how a gift-oriented system morphed into a demand-oriented system.
Understood. We are looking at the sociology of the shift.
Right.
So where does the paper point as the inflection point?
The first major tectonic shift was the Constantinian settlement in 313 CE. Think about the sociology of the early Christian communities. For the first 3 centuries, they were a marginalized minority. They possessed zero institutional power. They were frequently persecuted.
That lack of external power naturally fostered a psychological posture of dependence, mutual reliance, and reception. Want thinking is practically a survival requirement when you have no control over the state.
But then Emperor Constantine converts. The Edict of Milan is issued. Suddenly, almost overnight in historical terms, this marginalized community is handed the keys to the Roman Empire.
And that changes the psychological architecture completely.
When Christianity shifted from a persecuted sect to an imperial power, it gained legal authority, immense wealth, and the apparatus of the state. Takasugi refers to this process as the 6 stages of ontological corruption. It's an analysis of how power fundamentally rewires psychology. Power, by its very nature, generates entitlement claims.
Because suddenly, you have something to protect. If you are a house church meeting in secret, your only concern is survival and community. If you are the official religion of the empire, you suddenly have to manage property, enforce laws, and dictate cosmic truth. You have to determine who belongs and who is excluded.
The state requires compliance. You have to tell people what they must believe and what they must do to maintain social order. Institutional must-thinking became embedded in the framework, not necessarily out of malice, but out of the sheer logistical requirement of running an empire.
The psychological orientation shifted from, we humbly receive our daily bread, to, we dictate the terms of reality. The demand structure returned at an institutional level. But Takasugi points out that there was also a profound theological shift that occurred a century later, primarily associated with the Augustinian reception of Paul.
Augustine is obviously one of the most towering intellectuals in history, but Takasugi argues that the way his theology was received and amplified altered the psychological balance.
How so?
Augustine was writing amidst intense, fracturing theological controversies. He was fighting battles on multiple fronts against various heresies. In doing so, his reading of Paul heavily emphasized the total bondage of the human will to sin, the absolute necessity of irresistible grace, and the terrifying, unsearchable sovereignty of God.
Which, on a purely theological level, was his attempt to magnify God's grace.
Yes, but psychologically, as this theology was digested by the masses over the centuries, it shifted the structural baseline of the mind. The focus moved heavily toward the total depravity of the self, the terror of eternal condemnation, and the absolute requirement for strict compliance. The gift structure of early want thinking was slowly overlaid by an anxiety-laden demand structure.
The believer was taught to view themselves fundamentally as an unworthy debtor, terrified of the ledger, rather than a recipient of an unearned gift.
It is fascinating how any organization, whether it's a religion, a revolutionary political movement, or even a disruptive tech startup, starts with a radical pure vision. But the moment it achieves success and institutional power, the psychology of the founders is replaced by the psychology of the administrators.
The administrators use must thinking to protect the asset. It seems like institutionalizing anything automatically invites the demand structure back in.
It is the paradox of success, and it is a vulnerability baked into human sociology. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most practical part of Takasugi's paper. We have seen how the ancients practiced want thinking. We have seen how historical and institutional forces buried it under demand structures. The ultimate question is, how do we conceptualize, retrieve, and build this capacity in our own modern brains today? If we want to survive our own ambitions, what is the mechanism?
This is where the paper introduces a concept that I have not stopped thinking about since I read it. The concept is cognitive elasticity. To explain how this works, Takasugi uses a brilliant analogy from material science. He asks us to look at a shaped memory alloy, specifically something like nitinol, which is used in medical stents and robotics. Think about how different materials react when they are put under intense stress.
If a material is too rigid, like a pane of brittle glass, it cannot absorb shock. What happens when reality throws a baseball at it? It snaps, it shatters into 1,000 pieces. That is the physical manifestation of must thinking. The demand structure makes the mind incredibly rigid. When reality doesn't comply with the demand, the mind cannot adapt. It completely breaks down in a crisis of anxiety and anger.
On the other extreme, you have materials that are entirely weak in plastic, like a piece of wet clay. When stress hits the clay, it absorbs the impact, but it permanently deforms. It never bounces back to its original shape. It just flattens out. That is wishful thinking or fatalism. You experience a setback, and your desire just collapses. You lose your shape entirely and surrender to apathy.
But a shape memory alloy operates differently. On an atomic level, when it is placed under extreme mechanical stress, it absorbs the impact. It actually temporarily deforms to handle the load of the stress without fracturing. But the moment the stress is removed, the heat of its environment causes it to snap perfectly back into its original characteristic form.
It's like a highly engineered safety net. It catches the falling weight, stretches incredibly far, but then recoils back to its baseline instead of just shattering like the glass.
A cognitively elastic person operates exactly like that alloy. They have trained their mind to sustain genuine, intense, unfulfilled desire without snapping into angry demand or collapsing into apathetic indifference. When reality flat out refuses to comply with their desires, they absorb the perturbation, they feel the disappointment, the sadness, the grief. They temporarily deform to accommodate the weight of the reality they are facing, but they do not fracture, and over time they restore their orientation, returning to their baseline of agency and hope without deflating their original desire.
They bend, so they don't break, but they don't stay bent. And the most empowering part of this entire framework is that cognitive elasticity is conditional and is trainable. It's not a genetic lottery. You aren't just born a must thinker or a want thinker. You build the alloy. Just like the early communities built it with their 3 times a day rapid induction prayers, we can build it through intentional, repetitive habituation. We can train our nervous systems to hold desire loosely. It moves this entire concept from a lofty, abstract theological aspiration and turns it into a practical daily research and training program for the human mind.
It provides a psychological mechanism that makes want thinking stable under the crushing pressures of real life. It proves that you can hold ambition and non-entitlement simultaneously. And through deliberate practice, it becomes your automatic, somatic baseline, rather than something you have to exhaustively force your prefrontal cortex to do every single time you face a rejection.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today, weaving through thousands of years of thought. Let's do a quick structural recap. We started by diagnosing the trap. Must thinking, the cognitive glitch where our desires mutate into rigid entitlements that trigger our nervous systems into a state of perpetual threat. We explored Albert Ellis's clinical observations and saw how they perfectly map onto the oldest texts we have, from the raw, demanding nothing honesty of Yosemite, to the descriptive physics of the Beatitudes, to the tragic transactional mindset of the older brother. We unpacked Paul's structural diagnosis of the law as a demand system and grace as the collapse of entitlement. We looked at the early liturgy not as dead tradition, but as an autonomic nervous system training protocol designed to rewire the vagus nerve. We differentiated this path from the Stoic urge to amputate desire, choosing instead the third way that keeps us fully human. And finally, we looked at how to build the shape memory alloy of the human soul through cognitive elasticity.
It truly is a masterclass in moral psychology, hidden in plain sight within texts we thought we already understood.
It completely changes how you look at the architecture of your own goals. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Toward the end of the paper, Takasugi notes that want thinking shares some surface-level similarities with the Buddhist concept of non-attachment, which involves releasing the illusion of a permanent self. But structurally, want thinking is different. It's not about dissolving the self. It's about receiving the self and your desires as a fundamental gift. Building on that distinction, think about the culture we live in right now. Think about the modern, hyper-driven self-help and wellness culture that is absolutely obsessed with the concept of manifesting. We are constantly bombarded with messages telling us to envision our desires, put them on a vision board, declare them to the universe, and essentially demand that reality brings them to us. We're told that if we just believe hard enough, the universe has to obey. We frame it as empowerment. But based on everything we've uncovered today, we have to ask a terrifying question. Are these modern self-optimization trends actually trapping us in the deepest, most exhausting form of must-thinking? By trying to become the absolute masters of the universe, dictating reality through our positive vibes, are we actually making our nervous systems brittle and fragile? Could recovering this ancient 2,000-year-old cognitive elasticity, the simple, humble ability to want deeply but demand absolutely nothing, be the ultimate counterintuitive antidote to the burnout of the modern age?
That is the profound paradox we all need to evaluate in our own lives.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope this exploration gives you some powerful new lenses to look at your ambitions, your disappointments, and your own frameworks of desire. Keep asking the hard questions, keep tending to your garden, and whatever you do, stop trying to sue the sky. We'll catch you next time.